A child raised far from any religion suffers a near-death experience and returns with a surprising divine revelation. She claims to have found God and brings an urgent message to the world, a true, moving and spiritual account that will challenge your beliefs, strengthen your faith and make you reflect on the power of prayer, life after death, and the eternal purpose of the soul. Get ready for the shocking truth NDE that is impacting thousands. Her name is Ellis, a girl of just 6 years old, born and raised in the quiet town of Wilmington in North Carolina, a place surrounded by ancient trees, simple houses, and a community that is known by name, but where, in that particular house, the silence about God was absolute. Ellis lived with her parents in a comfortable, intellectually rich but spiritually empty home. His parents, two academic professionals, his father a biologist and his mother a historian, always made it clear that religion was just a set of old, unfounded stories. Faith for them was superstition, and prayer was a waste of time. Ellis grew up among science books and educational toys. His childhood was like that of any other happy child, but without any contact with Bibles, nightly prayers, or any mention of the name of Jesus. She was never baptized, never taken to a church. I have never heard anyone say the phrase "God bless you" in the house. Spirituality was an ignored, almost forbidden territory. It was as if that home had built an invisible wall, separating Ellis from any idea that there was anything beyond the physical world. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon, with yellowed leaves piling up on the sidewalks and the sky starting to turn orange. Ellis was excited, playing in the school playground, running with her friends. The teacher had just announced that the next day would be free because of a local holiday. The children were euphoric. In the innocence of childhood, everything seemed safe, peaceful, normal, until in an instant, everything changed. An oversight, an impulsive movement, trying to cross the street without looking to the side, and then the sound that no one wants to hear, the scream, the impact, the running footsteps, the tires squeaking on the asphalt. Ellis was hit by a car. Rescuers arrived within a few minutes, but right there at the scene they already noticed the seriousness of the situation. Ellis didn't respond. The pulse was absent. There were no respiratory signs. She was intubated right there, in the middle of the street, in the face of the despair of teachers, shocked classmates and parents who arrived moments later without yet understanding what they were about to face. At the hospital, doctors acted quickly. The emergency team did everything they could. All procedures were carried out to revive her. Chest compressions, injections, repeating commands out loud. But for a critical period, Ellis was clinically dead. For exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes in which, from a medical point of view, there was no cardiac activity. 4 minutes in which everything seemed lost. But what the doctors couldn't imagine, what the parents weren't prepared to understand, what even the team themselves couldn't explain, was what would happen next. Ellis's return in itself was already considered something extraordinary, but it was just the beginning. Without anticipating the details that we will reveal throughout this video, what we can say, without any exaggeration, is that something has changed in that child since that moment. Not just your look, but your presence, your way of speaking, the content of the words he said, something far beyond what medicine or science could justify. In the first days after the accident, while she was still hospitalized, doctors tried to explain her symptoms, reactions, and the way in which Ellis recovered with unusual speed. But there was something else going on. A detail here, another there. Small signs that left even the most experienced professionals with unanswered questions. And as the days went by, this feeling of something different grew. His parents, previously absolutely sure of their convictions, began to face doubts. The father, accustomed to dealing with cells and evolutionary theories, became increasingly silent during visits to the room. The mother, an expert in historical narratives, seemed to be trying, in vain, to find some logical reference for what was happening before her eyes. Ellis remained calm, observer, silent at times, intense at others, but he never went back to being exactly the same child as before. Not in behavior, not in speech, not in the way of looking at the world around you. And if you believe that nothing happens by chance, that stories like this come to us for a greater reason, then leave your like and subscribe to the channel now. This shows that you are open to listening, feeling, and living experiences that touch the soul. What happened to Ellis in the minutes following her return will surprise you, and that's exactly what we're going to start revealing now. The hospital room was silent. Only the monitors emitted their rhythmic sounds, interrupted here and there by the doctor's dry orders and the noise of the equipment being prepared. Ellis's eyes remained closed, her body motionless on the stretcher, and while outside the world seemed to wait with a heavy heart, inside her, something extraordinary was happening, a silence greater than any noise, a disconnection from matter that did not seem violent or abrupt. It was as if time had paused, as if the universe itself took a deep breath. Little by little, Ellis began to have the strange sensation that her body was becoming light, very light, lighter than air, as if she was being freed from a weight she had always carried but never knew existed. It was as if a tight garment was being taken off, and in that moment, she began to realize that it still existed, but not in the same way. Not with the eyes, not with touch, but with something deeper, consciousness, the soul. She was alive, but it was no longer life as she knew it. The sensation was of floating, of absolute freedom, of peace. There was no pain, fear, or confusion, just indescribable clarity. Ellis, now outside her own body, could see the people in the room. I recognized the faces, saw the movements, the doctors running, the nurse wiping sweat from her forehead, her desperate parents being kept outside. But all of this seemed distant, as if she was watching from afar, as if that part no longer belonged to her. And then a change, a presence, a light. It was no ordinary light. It wasn't a lamp or sunlight. It was a living light, a light that pulsed, that had a life of its own, which seemed smart. It was clear, intense, but not blinding. It was as if welcoming, as if hugging without arms, as if conversing without words. Ellis began to be attracted to this light, with a naturalness that escaped any human logic. There was no resistance, delivery only. As he approached, the environment changed again. It was as if she were entering another space, another dimension. There was no floor, no ceiling, no walls, but there was a constant presence of love and harmony in the air, a kind of ethereal garden where everything was made of essence, not matter, a place where time did not exist, where you don't age, where every detail seemed to contain a purpose, a peace so intense that it seemed to sing inside her. In this space, Ellis felt everything at the same time: warmth, peace, joy, and something she couldn't name. It was as if she had returned to a place she knew before she was even born, a place that was home, even though I had never been there. There was an old memory deep in the soul, something that said, "You've been here before, this is where you truly belong." And then, in the midst of that light, a figure appeared. She didn't see with eyes like we know her. It was like perceiving with the soul, as if that figure was formed by light and at the same time by presence. It was imposing, but not scary. She was grand, but bowed in humility. He was strong, but overflowing with compassion. She didn't have an exact shape, but Ellis knew. She knew with certainty that a child could have, that she was facing someone infinitely larger than anything that had ever existed. She didn't need to ask who it was. The answer was already inside her. It was as if that presence had always been there, even in moments when she didn't know it. She looked and felt, "This is the Father of all." It wasn't a constructed sentence. It was a truth imprinted inside her. This presence did not speak with words, but he communicated, and Ellis understood each word with her heart. It was a communication made of love, of wisdom, of a truth so clear that it cut through any doubt. And all she felt was an immense love, greater than any explanation. A love that knew her, that recognized her, that did not judge but that illuminated. She tried to look around, and even though I didn't know where I was, I didn't feel afraid. There was complete trust, as if everything was right, as if everything had always been part of a plan, a greater, perfect purpose. And even without having learned anything about faith or spirituality, Ellis understood. The soul understood. Every detail of that moment seemed carefully prepared. Every sensation, every whisper of light, every vibration in that environment. It was as if time had stopped so that girl could experience something sacred, something reserved, something that is not given to just anyone. She felt that that moment was not just a visit. It was a date, a reunion perhaps, something that went beyond the limits of the flesh and mind, something that connected heaven with earth, eternity with now. It was as if she was being reminded of who she really was, not just any child but an eternal soul, and the presence before her was more than a being, was the Creator. There was no religion, doctrine, or speech. There was connection. Elise, without ever having said a prayer in her life, was now taken by a living prayer, a prayer that came from the depths of being, which was done without words, without rituals, without rules, a prayer of the soul that bows before the divine, not out of fear, but out of recognition, for love. Everything she felt, and that she would later try to explain with the limited words of a child, was that this was the place of truth, the place where everything makes sense, the place where we all came from, and where we will all, one day, return. But something in that environment began to change, subtly, slowly, like a breath coming from far away, and she felt that what she was experiencing wouldn't last forever. The light around Ellis began to intensify. It wasn't an intensity that hurt. On the contrary, it seemed to warm you from the inside, as if each beam penetrated straight into your essence, dissolving any pain, any fear, any bad memory. It was as if the love that existed there had shape, weight, temperature. The presence she had felt before, the one she had instinctively called the Father of all, was now closer, clearer, more alive. Ellis didn't see him the way someone sees someone with physical eyes. It was different. She perceived it with her soul. She felt every detail as if it were made of the same substance that now surrounded her. There was no defined face, but there was a look. There was no mouth, but she heard every word. There were no hands, but she felt as if she were being touched with a tenderness that no human being could ever replicate. It was direct communication, without noise, without barriers, heart with heart, spirit with spirit. That being and that living, conscious and immense light was the Creator himself. There was no doubt, there was no questioning. It was as if all the answers of existence were contained in that instant. Ellis felt that she was facing something infinitely greater than the mind could comprehend, but strangely familiar, as if he had returned to where he came from, the place to which all souls one day return. And then the light spoke, not with audible words, but with a truth that exploded inside her like echoes in all directions. It wasn't a sound. It was a certainty, a revelation, a summons. You haven't finished your mission yet. Ellis felt as if something had ignited inside her at that moment, as if his existence had been reminded of an original purpose, forgotten in the folds of time and flesh. Those words echoed in her as if they were part of her origin. And then the light continued. You need to tell them that I exist, and that they have forgotten who they really are. These words did not come as an order. They came as a calling, an awakening, a responsibility engraved in the soul. Ellis, so small, so pure, so devoid of any earthly belief, now received a mission, not from men but directly from the source of life. It was as if the universe itself was asking her to take back a lost memory, a divine reminder, a message that could only be conveyed by someone who saw what she saw, who felt what she felt. She didn't ask why. He didn't question it, because in that place the why was already answered before it even emerged. Everything made sense. Everything was full. Everything vibrated with a love that surpassed any human understanding. The pain we know on earth, the fear that paralyzes us, the guilt, the anxiety, none of that existed there. There was only recognition, the clarity, the connection with something eternal. While the present spoke, Elise saw images, but they weren't like dreams. They were real. They were clear visions, full of meaning. She saw people walking in the middle of the darkness, distracted, running from one side to the other, looking at the ground, busy with things that seemed important, but that there, in that plane, had no weight at all. And the light said to him, "They have forgotten who they are. They have forgotten me. They have forgotten the light that I placed in them. They are lost in passing things. But I have not abandoned them. I never have. They just need to remember." Ellis felt everything as if it were part of her. The pain of the world, the loneliness of people, the void that screams silently in the hearts of so many. She understood everything. I felt the urgency of the message, and at the same time the infinite compassion of that presence that didn't accuse, didn't punish, just called back. The light enveloped her once again, and in that armless embrace, Ellis understood something that she herself would not be able to explain in human words later. It was as if all of existence was vibrating in a single truth. God is real. God is love. And God is waiting for us to remember Him. She heard, or rather felt, that every human being carries a spark of this light within them, that we were created to shine with it, that life is not a chance, it is not an accident, that we all have a sacred purpose. And that somewhere along the way we moved away from that, and that's why Ellis was called. Not to talk about religion, not to defend doctrines, not to debate theories, but to remind people that there is something bigger, something true, something eternal, and that something is someone. That moment was the most profound of his entire existence, an instant that cannot be measured in human time, an encounter that goes beyond the boundaries of logic, a truth that cannot be erased. She didn't know how much time had passed. I didn't know where his body was. All she knew was that she was with him, and that in some way that she still didn't understand, she needed to return. But back to what? This question began to gain space within her. The peace of that place was so absolute that no part of his soul wanted to leave. The light seemed to understand this. There was no insistence. There was just a silent look, an exchange of essence, a yes that didn't need to be said. And before she could understand, a new wave of energy enveloped her, a wave that pulled her back, but to remember, to wake up, to comply. And it is at this point that something starts to happen, something that would transform not only Ellis's life, but also that of everyone around her, something that goes beyond explanation and that many may try to deny, but that, deep down, everyone recognizes, even if silently. The soul knows when it has seen the truth. If this story is touching something inside you, write it here in the comments. God, show me my mission. These phrases are not just words, they are spiritual statements, and they can be the first step towards a reunion with God, with yourself, with the truth that lives silently inside, waiting for a moment like this. The room looked like any other in a pediatric ward. Equipment all around, the white bed, the soft ceiling lights reflecting on the walls. But what happened in that space that morning was anything but ordinary. When Elise opened her eyes, the first few seconds were silent. The monitors signaled their heartbeats. They were stable, alive, present. The doctors looked at each other with surprised expressions. The nurse took a step back, and the parents, and they could barely move. It was as if time had stopped. Again, she blinked. He took a deep breath, and then, as if something bigger moved her, she began to speak. The first phrase that came out of Ellis's mouth was not mommy nor daddy. It wasn't a cry nor a complaint, it wasn't a question. It was a statement. With her eyes fixed on the ceiling, with a calm voice, but filled with an authority that did not match her age, she said, "The world is too distracted to hear the truth, but the time is coming." Silence. The parents looked at each other as if they had heard wrong, but she repeated it, almost as if you were quoting something that needed to be said, as if he had rehearsed. But at the same time, it was the first time. But there was no way I could have rehearsed it, because Ellis had never heard that from anyone. I had never read a Bible. I had never even attended a church. In the minutes that followed, Ellis began to describe things that seemed beyond a child's comprehension. His words, although simple, carried weight. He spoke as if he was remembering, not inventing. As if he was reliving something that had just happened, something still fresh in his soul, and each sentence came out like a real little arrow, hitting the heart of whoever was in the room. She looked into space, but she saw beyond. He said that people were too busy with things that don't last, what hearts were hardened, that there was too much noise in thoughts for God's voice to be heard. He used exactly this expression, voice of God. The parents, stunned, didn't know how to react. How could a 6-year-old child, raised in complete spiritual isolation, say something like that? That was when she surprisingly mentioned the name of Jesus, not with the learned tone, but with the tone of someone he knew. She said, "He called me by name. He showed me that everyone has a light, but that many are letting that light go out." And then he started quoting phrases that sounded familiar. But for his parents, they were totally unexpected. One of them, said almost in a whisper, made the mother shudder. "He who has ears, let him hear." The father, not knowing exactly what it meant, later looked it up on the internet. He discovered that this phrase appears several times in the New Testament, said by Jesus himself. Ellis never had access to this. Not in books, not in videos, not in conversations. The family has always avoided any subject of a spiritual nature. But there, in front of everyone, that little girl was describing, with tranquility and conviction, passages, visions, feelings and truths that could not come from anywhere, except from within, or from above. She spoke of places of light, of people who cried in silence because they had forgotten who they were. He said that many were lost without knowing they were lost. It talked about choices, about repentance, and about a love so great that it doesn't fit into words. He said God still speaks, which is still waiting, that still calls. But the part that affected her parents the most, and that made the nurse leave the room to wipe her tears, was when Ellis looked at them and said firmly, "You have forgotten who you are, but there is still time to come back." Those words, simple in form, had a profound impact. They were like a spiritual mirror, like a whisper from heaven. There was no accusation. There was truth. There was compassion. But there was also urgency. Ellis continued speaking as if she were being guided, as if it was being used to convey something that needed to be heard. He said people needed to pray more, that they no longer knew how to silence, that the rush of the world was swallowing the silence where God usually speaks. He mentioned that the heavens were showing signs, but few were paying attention. He used expressions such as, "Time is speeding up," and "the time is near." He said that many were joking about serious things, who were living as if they would never be accountable, and they were forgetting the most important thing, the soul itself. The mother tried to interrupt. I wanted to know who had told her that. Ellis just replied, "I'm just repeating what he asked me to say." This didn't seem like a daydream, much less childish imagination. It was as if, somehow, a higher consciousness had passed through this girl, as if a divine spark had been rekindled, and now she was the channel. Doctors called specialists, psychologists, neurologists. They did exams, language tests, memory tests, and none of them could explain the clarity of the speeches nor the details of the reports. And once again, at another moment, alone with her mother, Ellis repeated with her eyes fixed, "He said there's still time, but it's running out." That statement echoed like thunder in the mother's soul. It made something inside her tremble. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, something that she herself always knew, but never had the courage to face. And now, he was hearing it from his own daughter. As the days went by, Ellis began to repeat less, but the intensity of that first moment never left the minds of those who heard it. Every sentence of hers seemed to carry something more, something that surpassed the intellect. It was as if that little voice had touched directly into places that had been dormant for a long time. And this is the part of the story that leaves everyone perplexed, because what Ellis said, and the way she said it, was not something you learned. It was something that receive, and maybe something that remember. In the days that followed, the hospital room where Ellis was admitted became less of a clinical space and more of a territory of silence, observation, and reflection. With each visit, the mother remained at the bedside for longer. Before she was practical, rational, impatient with long conversations. Now she sat for hours, watching her daughter sleep, trying to find the same girl in her face as always, and at the same time dealing with the uncomfortable and sacred feeling that something in her had changed forever. It was as if Ellis had a new shine in her eyes, as if she had come back from somewhere and was still partially connected to him. The mother didn't know exactly how to deal with it. It wasn't easy to deconstruct everything she believed, or rather, everything she refused to believe. Throughout his adult life, he rejected any idea of a spiritual world, not out of hate, but out of logic. It didn't make sense. It was old-fashioned, useless. Words like faith, prayer, salvation, divine purpose have always seemed empty. But now here, in front of her daughter, who spoke of impossible things with absurd serenity, she felt the foundations of her reason tremble. In the hospital corridors, I avoided glances. You knew what they were talking about. Doctors, nurses, even other parents of hospitalized children came to ask, and she didn't know what to answer. What do you say when your 6-year-old daughter, without ever having read the Bible, quotes verses, describes encounters, and conveys messages that not even adults fully understand. So she did what she never imagined doing. She started researching. In secret, in the early hours of the morning, sitting in a corner of the room, I searched for videos, articles, reports of near-death experiences. He began to discreetly watch testimonies from people who said they had seen the light, heard voices, received messages. He compared what his daughter said with that, and the more I looked, the harder it was to keep denying it. She cried in silence, sometimes hidden in the hospital bathroom, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in the elevator, between one floor and another. She cried because she felt confused. She cried because deep down, something inside her knew that she had always suspected there was something more, but she chose to ignore it. I cried out of fear, for repentance, and for feeling, for the first time, that God, maybe, was really there, and he was calling her back. The father, on the other hand, maintained resistance. Of them all, he was the most firm in his disbelief. He had been raised in a home where logic was an absolute value, a man of science, of methods, of equations. But it wasn't cold. He loved his daughter deeply, and that's why he started listening, not by faith but for love. He did not question Elise directly, but he watched, and that disarmed him. She spoke with a calmness that would challenge any child, and more than that, with a maturity that didn't fit his age. He tried to find fault. I was sure that at some point she would contradict herself, confuse the details, repeat something she watched in secret. But no, she was firm, coherent, Clara. And he didn't seem to be trying to convince anyone, just counting. What moved him most was a specific detail. One afternoon, as he adjusted his daughter's pillow, she looked at him with that deep, almost uncomfortable look and said, "I saw Grandma, Mommy's mom. She smiled at me. She said she's fine. She's holding flowers in her hand." The father froze. The mother, who was next to her, put her hand over her mouth. Ellis didn't know, she never knew, that her maternal grandmother had died before she was born. There were no photos. The family avoided talking about the subject. It was an old pain left aside. But there, in the middle of that apparently simple conversation, Ellis clearly described something that no one had told her. The bouquet of lilies that her grandmother was holding in the coffin. The same flower she always took to church services when she was still alive. The silence that fell after this speech lasted longer than any other. The mother began to shake. The father, for the first time, could not contain his tears. He tried to argue, to say that it could be a coincidence, that the child could have heard something by accident. But deep down he knew. I knew this was no coincidence. I knew there was something there, something that logic could not explain, and that he might never explain. From that day on, he began to visit the room with less haste, listening more carefully. He did not declare himself a believer, nor did he say he believed, but he stopped denying it. Meanwhile, Elise remained calm. It would be natural to expect a child, faced with so much attention, to become excited, anxious or agitated. But no, she remained serene, as if I was still connected to something bigger, as if the presence that surrounded her during the experience was still there, beside her. As if she knew that it was all part of something much bigger than anyone around her could understand. She didn't insist on telling more than she needed to. He didn't force anyone to believe. He just said what he felt, what I saw, what I remembered, with the sweetness of a child and the firmness of someone who has seen the truth. This new phase of the family was not marked by screams, nor by visible supernatural manifestations. It was marked by silence, for long looks, for sleepless nights, for lonely tears, for prayers said for the first time even if in secret, for Bible pages opened with trembling hands, by old songs being played at low volume on the cell phone, for new questions, and for a certainty that is still shy, but emerging. This question, although simple, carries enormous weight because it is not just about what you see with your eyes, but about what you feel in the depths of your soul. How many times have you noticed something strange, subtle, like an inexplicable coincidence, a silent presence, a shiver in the middle of a poorly said prayer, a dream that seemed more real than the next day? How many times has something inside you screamed for attention, and yet you chose the noise of routine over the whisper of the invisible? Maybe you, who are listening to me now, have had nights when you felt something in the air and couldn't explain it. Maybe you saw someone leave and yet felt that person was still close by. Or maybe you never believed in anything, until life showed you something impossible to ignore. Ellis's story has shaken people all over the world, not just because it is moving or mysterious, but because it holds a mirror up to us, a spiritual mirror. And in it, we see how far we are from what we should remember every day. We have a soul, and that soul has a purpose. If it were your son, would you believe it? This question hurts. It forces the heart to stop for a second and imagine what would happen if suddenly a child who had never heard of God began to speak of him with more conviction than many adults. How would you react? Would you try to silence it, justify, to deny, or would you start listening with your heart? That's what this story proposes. An invitation. Not an invitation to follow a religion, nor to wear a belief as a label, but an invitation to allow yourself to listen. Listen deeply, with presence, with soul. Maybe God has been trying to talk to you for years. Maybe he has already given you signs, small or big, but you interpreted them as luck, chance, coincidence. Maybe he sent someone, a stranger, a relative, a word at the right time, a song that gave you goosebumps out of nowhere. Maybe even this story today didn't come to you by chance. Think about it with me. How many times do we close ourselves off from the invisible because we are afraid? Fear of appearing weak, of appearing foolish, of appearing naive. But do you know what's more dangerous than looking weak? It's wasting the time you still have left. It's living a lifetime disconnected from what really matters. How many times have you looked at the sky in silence, without words, and felt like someone was listening to you? How many times, faced with suffering, have you said, "God, give me a sign," and has the signal already come and you haven't seen it? Now, I want to ask you again, but this time in more depth. Could it be that you are also ignoring the signs around you? Signs that can come across a child, of a repeated word, from a verse that appears out of nowhere, from a video you decide to watch on impulse, from a sentence that someone says and makes you stop. Signs that don't scream, signs that whisper. Ellis is not here to convince you of anything. She just told what she saw, what you heard, what you felt. And you are free to feel whatever you want. But one thing is for sure, you're not hearing this for nothing. None of us escape the moment when the soul calls us back, and that moment could be now. Maybe you're listening to this on any given day. Maybe I accidentally clicked play. Maybe someone sent you this video. But now he is here in front of you and telling you, God is still speaking, and he wants you to remember who you are. Then take a deep breath. Feel that silence inside. He's saying something. Feeling something deep when you hear this story is a sign that something inside you is being awakened. When the heart beats differently, it is because the soul has recognized a truth that can no longer be ignored. Leave this recorded in the comments. Write sincerely, "I don't want to ignore the signs anymore." This simple phrase can be the beginning of a new journey, and it can also be the sign that someone else is waiting to wake up. These phrases, in addition to strengthening your connection with the message, help other people who come this far to understand that they are not alone. Sometimes the testimony of a stranger wakes us up more than 1,000 sermons. Feeling God's voice in this video is a sign that something inside you is awakening. When a story touches the heart like this, it's not by chance. It's a response. It's care. It's the beginning of a transformation. This channel is for those who recognize the signs, for those who understand that faith is more than believing. It is living something deep, true, and eternal. Here, each story carries hope. Each message rekindles purpose. We are not just hearing reports. We are being called back to essence. Here we feel, we reflect. People wake up. Feeling that God spoke to you through this story is more than emotion. It's a call for transformation. So, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and leave your like. Your action helps this message reach other souls who are also seeking answers. Something even deeper awaits you in the next video. What comes next could completely change the way you see all of this. It's already there on the screen. Just click. Each story reveals a part, and the next one may be just the one that speaks directly to you. The journey continues, and the truth is just beginning to be revealed.